שבת שלום, צהריים טובים. עברו קצת יותר משנתיים מאז שישראל וירדן חתמו על הסכם השלום ביניהן, ונדמה שבמהלך הזמן הלא קצר הזה, עבדה לנו משהו מהאופוריה הראשונית שליוותה את התהליך הזה. נדמה שכאילו האופוריה הזאת פינתה את מקומה להכרה מפוקחת יותר של המציאות הבעייתית במזרח התיכון. לא מעט פרויקטים משותפים ישראלים וירדנים לא יצאו אל הפועל במהלך התקופה הזאת, ומעל היחסים בין שתי המדינות מרחף כענן המשא ומתן הבעייתי עם הפלסטינים. פגוש את העיתונות מתארחת השבוע בארמון המלוכה באמן, באדיבותו של יורש העצר הירדני, הנסיך חסן בן טלאל. At this time, I would like to thank you, Your Highness, for inviting us here to this beautiful palace, and thank you also for participating in the show. Welcome.
Thank you for coming, and I caught the word euphoria, and I hope that we can dwell on that theme.
I would like to welcome also my colleagues, Aaron Barnea and Akiva Eldar. And Your Highness, after all I read and heard about you, can we conduct this interview, for example, in Hebrew?
I think we could, but for purposes of our audience, I think it's better that we conduct it in English today, at least. Maybe on a future visit to Israel, I will have the possibility of speaking Hebrew.
Your Highness, what did you learn Hebrew?
I learned in Oxford, at the hands of Professor Geza Vermesh, who, as you know, is a leading scholar, not least of all on the subject of the Dead Sea Scrolls. And then through the kind intermediation of the École Biblique in Jerusalem. And in terms of my association with the scholarly Jewish community in Oxford, I'm happy to say that it's a relationship and a friendship that has lasted through wars and through conflict. And
you know, I'm asking the question because many people in Israel have noticed that almost in every speech that you deliver where Israelis are present, you take a point in bringing a quotation from the Bible in Hebrew. And it's rarely, very rare that you hear Israeli people of state or politicians that can quote verses of the Quran, for example. And I would like to know what is your attitude towards that or your comment.
Well, I mentioned euphoria earlier, and I think that tikva, hope, is really what we're talking about here today. We're trying to instill a perspective of the future, but when you cite the Holy Book, clearly you have to refer to the text, and you refer to a constant. And I think whether it is the Old Testament, whether it is the Quran, I think it's crucially important for people to realize the authenticity of our shared quest for peace and stability.
Your Highness, let me pick up on where you left on hope. We're sitting here 2 years and also about 5 months after the Israeli elections. And it seems that some people in Israel and maybe in the Arab world have suffered some kind of schizophrenia. There is a consensus about the need for peace with the Arab world. On the other hand, we all know that the Oslo Agreement is now in quite a trouble. Now, how much more can the peace agreement between Israel and Jordan can take? How many more crises? Does it have its own vitality?
I think the conflict today is not between perceptions of Arabs and Israelis. It's between Israelis and Israelis, between Arabs and Arabs, between Jews and Jews. If you look at some of our interlocutors in the Orthodox Jewish community and others in the Reform community, there's a very deep-rooted hatred between Muslims and Muslims. I would say also there is an extreme and activist Islamic view, many of whom probably would find it very difficult to watch this interview. The concept of a Muslim Arab country talking to Israel and the concept of peace. But I would like to say that there is no alternative, effectively, to a vision of peace other than a vision of yesteryear, a vision of war, a vision of conflict. And remember, effectively, that we either live and survive together or we disintegrate at the expense of all.
But Your Highness, the question is whether the Israeli-Jordanian peace can sustain itself if there is no progress on the Palestinian track.
I think that the Israeli-Jordanian peace treaty is a commitment by two states to a very formal and solemn ending of the state of war. It is a commitment also to a concept of sharing a space in this part of the world on the basis of respect for each other as sovereign states. If you throw that out of the window, you're going back to the context, effectively, of expedient politics, security as interpreted by one country at the expense of the other. So I would turn the question on its head and say that the future of the Palestinian track should be encouraged and nurtured by the stability of Israeli-Jordanian relations.
And at this point, exactly, Your Highness, did your expectation of the peace treaties between Israel and Jordan today, did your expectation met reality? Are you satisfied with the progress we made?
Well, I would be more satisfied if we were conducting this interview in Tel Aviv or Jerusalem. But clearly there have been acts of violence, South Lebanon, Ashkelon, Jerusalem, Ramallah, Hebron, Gaza, and clearly emotions are running high, whether Arab or Israeli. If you or I had lost relatives, obviously it's very difficult for us to sit and talk rationally. So it is this atmosphere, effectively, I think, that has taken a lot out of the peace treaty, out of the spirit to move forward. But on the other hand, I'm a realist, and I think that there are so many possibilities of joint action. Look at President Weizmann's recent visit. We went down to the Dead Sea Works. We saw good things being done in bad times, turning the Dead Sea into a sea of life. In terms of tangibles, there's much more that can be done in clusters of related subjects: economy, trade, human resource development. Scientists get on the best, I think, probably, in terms of absolutes. But, of course, it's still a confused time.
Where is the turning point? The assassination of Yitzhak Rabin or the elections in Israel?
Well, didn't one, in a sense, lead to the other? Wasn't the security issue paramount during the election debate? Isn't it paramount today? I think that it is important to say, as an outsider, let me be quite frank, from the Israeli body politic, that I don't want to comment on the dynamics of what happens in Israel, but it is noticeable that if you look at the European community, if you look at outside opinion and criticism, particularly since the Hashmonaean tunnel affair, that people are talking at each other at different tracks. On the one side, the issue of security is paramount. On the other side, the issue of moving the peace treaty forward and honoring agreements is of great importance. So it seems to me, to go back to my earlier remark, that the differences between Israelis over the future of sharing this space, this intercommunal space, Arab, Palestinian, Israeli space, is part of the malaise after the assassination of the late Prime Minister Rabin. And the malaise continues today, and I think the Hashmonaean tunnel affair obviously has not helped.
You said right after the assassination of late Prime Minister Rabin, when you visited his wife Leah Rabin,
Yes.
that you believe still that the assassination wouldn't change the stability of the peace process in the Middle East. Would you stand behind this declaration also nowadays?
I believe that even the late Prime Minister Rabin represents a focus of stability, which is important until this present day. And I think that that stability, in terms of the substance of the peace treaties achieved, is still there. Of course, we can all make political noises about warning each other over the red line that we don't want to cross, warning each other about the imminence of violence or the possibilities of confrontation. But in that sense, we are playing into the hands of those who are not committed to peace anyway. And ideologically, they exist in the Israeli community as they exist in the Arab world.
Do you have a second thought about the sequence of this peace process? Since some Israelis feel that they had the opportunity to taste the fruits of peace without tackling the need to offer real concessions, territorial concessions. And perhaps they have this illusion that we can have it both ways. I mean, you can have peace for peace.
Look, as Jordanians and as Palestinians, as Jordanians here in Jordan, as Palestinians in the territories, it's very clear to us that there are two basic issues that have to be addressed. One, you need living space for Palestinians. I mean, this is very clear. On their soil, the international community has recognized their inalienable rights. And today, when you hear settlements and fattening of settlements, frankly, it's very difficult for us here in Jordan to look at our own self-interest and to say, well, is this going to lead to a forced migration of refugees? Clearly, this is something that has not been accepted even in the peace treaty. We do not accept any action that changes the status quo on the occupied territories.
So how can you hope for a development in the peace process or enhancement when you have today a government in Israel that tells you frankly that we do not accept this basic principle of peace for land?
It's not for me to identify the next priorities in what is a Palestinian-Israeli negotiation, but clearly if this peak can be surmounted, the Hebron issue I'm referring to here, then presumably the talks will begin to gain some momentum factually on the ground. But today we're talking about so many anecdotes, even the playing with words, peace for peace, peace for land. At the end of the day, it's factual evidence that counts, not anecdotes.
Is this playing of words with you, for you?
Well, I think I am looking at the overall picture, not appealing to a particular political audience here. I'm talking to you as people concerned as I am with the future of peace. So if it is peace for peace, including an exchange of land, if it is an intercommunal solution that develops rights for the two communities to live in peace, then in a sense you have combined both.
But Your Highness, excuse me, I want to ask you a difficult question. There were voices in the Arab world that suggested this week that if Israel will go on postponing the signing, the implementation of the Oslo Agreement with the Palestinians, it will endanger its peace treaties with the Arab country that she signed it with them. It means with Egypt and with Jordan. Do you agree with that statement?
I'll tell you, I met a group of right-wing Anglo-Saxons. I don't want to define the nationality the other day. And of course, many of them are more supportive of hardline Israelis than hardline Israelis themselves. And I heard for the first time the question, do the Arabs have a mind? And I said, look, if you're asking me an impertinent question, I would ask you, do you have a mind? But as far as I'm concerned, we have a resolve, we have a purpose, and that purpose has been very clearly stated. We are interested in peace. Then comes the next question. Why do we have to work with you moderates when the extremists represent the new wave? Why don't we keep the Palestinians at arm's length? Why don't we go back to a Cold War situation? Now, of course, if we want to look at the dark side, at the downside, and say the peace treaty is threatened by this kind of thinking, that I cannot accept, because clearly, even if the peace treaty is crawling along, it's better that it crawls along and gains momentum in the future than it stops, than that it stops. And once again, I am a realist, and I don't see that this region can be committed to conflict and war.
There is a real debate in Israel between separatists and, if you know what I mean, people who believe in separation. There's so many years of hatred and violence and animosity between us and the Palestinians, not the Jordanians, and people who believe in a new Middle East, the optimistic plan, and who believe in integration. Do you think that we are prepared right now for this kind of Commonwealth community?
I believe in the old Middle East being brought into the new world. I believe in the findings of the manuscripts of the Ben Ezra synagogue in Cairo, which describe trade between Sijil Mas and Morocco, Cairo, Aden, and the Malabar coast for 6 centuries. And when Vasco da Gama came off that coast and said to the Jain rulers who are pacifists, evict the Arabs and the Jews or I will kill you, they said to him, what is kill? So effectively, why do we assume that the Middle East has to be about conflict? Why cannot the Middle East return to its heritage of peaceful coexistence?
Because of different interests?
Well, what about vested interests? Should we talk about vested interests? Are we talking about oil? Are we talking about weapons? Are we talking about people and their happiness and their dignity?
I would like to go back now to the relations between governments of Jordan and Israel. Yasser Arafat kept saying recently that he doesn't believe a word Prime Minister Netanyahu is saying. Do you have confidence in Prime Minister Netanyahu?
Do Do you have on record a commitment of Prime Minister Netanyahu to qualify his feelings about Mr. Arafat?
Well, yes, his visit here in Amman.
I don't really like to get into this business of personalization, and again, as I said, this is anecdotal evidence, not necessarily.
But Your Royal Highness, Netanyahu's visit to Amman and before that to Cairo, promising that he will continue in implementing what was agreed upon. And until now, not much has happened on the ground.
Well, again, I think that you have an elected government within the context of the peace treaty. We signed an agreement between states, which is a cross-party, bipartisan agreement. And I would think that it is important to keep your interlocutor engaged. But if we are going to get to a point where your interlocutor says, well, I can turn to my hardliners and this is not taking me anywhere, then I think we have to worry about the future.
I have here a short report of a meeting with Minister Muasher. And he was trying to convince his guest that the future of the West Bank depends primarily or exclusively on Israeli-Palestinian negotiations, and that Jordan will not be involved. And he mentioned that when he tried to convince Prime Minister Netanyahu, when he was still ambassador in Israel, he was quite surprised to hear this remark from the Prime Minister: "You don't know the Jordanian leadership. I know them better. You're wrong." What can you say about that?
Well, it shows the great truth spirit, doesn't it?
What can you say about the involvement of Jordan in the next phase of the you hear, of course, from the Prime Minister this idea about bypassing the interim phase and jumping directly to the final status negotiations, which will, of course, involve Jordan one way or the other.
I think that the region has to deal with absolutes. We have to deal with economic cooperation. We have to deal with security-related issues, whether current security. We shouldn't be rushing to a Sharm el-Sheikh meeting to talk about our measures against terrorism, only to find terrorism and acts of violence changing once again the appearance of Middle East peace. And lastly, I think that we have to focus on this all-important issue of cultural dialogue. When we join forces against discrimination, against anti-Semitism, against Islamophobia, then I think that we are giving a message to the world. We are pluralist by definition, but we can't go on referring to pluralism as the dirty P word.
Your Royal Highness, I would like to ask you a question that may be a little difficult, even for me. It's not a secret, and I'm sure that you are absolutely aware of it, that there is a great deal or a great part of Israeli political arena on the right side of it that has believed for many years that the only solution for the Palestinian problem is an alternative homeland on the east of the Jordan. Now the people who represent this long years of ideology are actually in power in our government. And we have already a peace agreement that has been signed by a different party, political thinking orientation. What is your comment about
I hope, going back to Prime Minister Netanyahu's book, A Place Among the Nations, that he is considering revising some of the things that he wrote at that time, because clearly they fly in the face of the spirit of peacemaking and peace building. And maybe that's an issue I can raise with him at some stage in the future. But I think that there are 5 provinces of Palestinian refugees in Egypt, Syria, Lebanon, Jordan, and the occupied territories. I think there is a move to cut back financing for Palestinian refugee camps. I think it's important that we focus on the essentials, compensation from the international world community, and for us as Arabs to keep the issue of the right of return alive. And I know there are many Jews also who would consider the right of return in terms of the countries they left in an Arab context. But all of this is very far-fetched. The most important thing today is to say that the stability of Jordan means a non-discriminatory improvement of the quality of life for everyone living in Jordan. But to wish the problem of refugees away and to put them somewhere else is a broad brush stroke, which is a recipe for further conflict and evading the whole issue. Are we interested in living together peacefully or not?
Your Highness, I would like to speak now about the big problem, Jerusalem. Abu Ala, the chairman of the Palestinian Council, said in this program last week that without Jerusalem, there's no peace, as simple as that. Do you believe that there is any solution to the problem in the Middle East if the government in Israel will go on consistent to have total control over Jerusalem?
As far as political sovereignty in Jerusalem, as far as municipal rights in Jerusalem, as far as physical changes in Jerusalem, this issue is very much a Palestinian priority in ongoing discussion, leading to the final status. And clearly, the Palestinians have their aspirations to a capital in Jerusalem. They have their aspirations to recognition of their municipal rights and the aggregate of their human rights, including their economic and spiritual rights. As far as Jordan is concerned, I'd just like to go back to a visit by a Jewish American group some years ago, when someone said the crowning glory is God's in Jerusalem. Sovereignty is to the Almighty. And I said, I agree entirely with this, but at the same time, please ask, I think it was the Begin government at that time, the then incumbent prime minister, how do we share in the one God? So it is extremely important to emphasize interreligious dialogue leading to a sharing at the end of this millennium. We can't be invited to celebrate if we are not invited to share, and we can't share unless day-to-day issues are put on the table a little bit more clearly. So I agree there with what Abu Ala said, that effectively Jerusalem is, I think, the most difficult negotiating issue, but in a sense it is a symbol of peace.
Your Highness, you were speaking about creating a new Middle East identity. What are its ingredients? What is it? Is it possible?
There is no corporate identity for West Asia, Near East, Eastern Mediterranean, Middle East. All these are new slogans, effectively, that are trying to describe a region that has no economic council, that has no established dialogue in political terms, which transcends the Arab world. Yes, we have the Arab League. Yes, we have the Gulf Cooperation Council. But if we're going to talk about Turkey, if we're going to talk about participation in the broader region, assuming Iraq and Iran are not kept out of the region interminably by dual containment, then we have to recognize that the Western Hemisphere jumps over West Asia to meet with East Asia in Bangkok. And it's as if this region is some kind of a black hole. So I think that the concept of Helsinki, the concept of Barcelona, of Madrid, which have been agreed to by all the countries in the region. I mean, certain countries have approved of Madrid and not have approved of Barcelona and vice versa. But the idea of three baskets, a cultural basket, an economic cluster of issues, and indeed political security-related issues is so important. And once again, I do want to say that we have no conflict prevention center, no conflict resolution center in this region. So effectively, we manage by crisis management from day to day. And I hope that we can talk about absolutes when we refer to 42 countries from Vancouver to Vladivostok. When we talk about the OSCE involvement in Grozny among the Chechen, it's true effectively that these countries are not at peace with each other. These entities are not living tranquilly with each other, but at least there is a possibility of a dialogue.
Is that feasible at all, Your Highness? One of those baskets that you have just mentioned now, for example, this security framework that you were talking about, to include Arab countries like Egypt, okay, but Saudi Arabia and Syria and Israel?
Well, if you look at the word premature, obviously it's premature to talk about new clubs and new groupings. I'm not talking about a club or a grouping. I'm talking about an umbrella concept. The Gulf countries are supported by Western powers. They buy their weapons in the West. Israel does the same. Turkey does the same. Egypt does the same. So do we. As for Syria, obviously they're extremely interested in changing the international image and being regarded as a responsible contributing country, and Syria obviously has a lot to offer to regional stability if it joins the peace process. So it is at least a vision of the future.
Naturally, a coalition or an alliance needs an opposition, an enemy, who is our mutual enemy.
I think probably ourselves. But I think that we're not talking about a coalition or an alliance against somebody. The beauty of it is that the Helsinki process was a process of dialogue in the post-war period, where the then Soviet Union and the United States sat down, reneged on promises, reneged on agreements, walked out of meetings, shouted at each other. But at least in the words of Churchill, jaw was better than war. There was a transparent process. Today, everyone has a private agenda. Many of us are scowling at each other, and it's informed guesses like this interview that lead us to coming to the conclusion of why these antagonistic positions are taken. So enough posturing, and let's get down to some hard work.
Your Highness, to conclude this conversation, I would like to ask you, you yourself and Shimon Peres shared a notion of a new Middle East. Do you think this vision is maybe a fiction nowadays? Is maybe only a dream, a far dream?
Or the human dimension of it?
I think that in terms of human aspirations, when His Majesty sat with the late Prime Minister Rabin, and you referred to Shimon, I want to say that I was asked by Israeli television, what did I think of these exchanges? And I said, they're all very well, but you have to get down to understanding what people are thinking in homes, in Israel, in the Palestinian territories, and here. Still, we're told by polls that over 50% of people are convinced that peace is the only way. What is their angle? What is their position? I think that this visit by Moshe Katsav, the Deputy Prime Minister, who hails from Iran originally, it was very interesting for me because you had different cultural perceptions. And once again, I do want to say that the time has come to work, as many Israeli and Arab writers would like to work, on the concept of identifying who are they. Not only who are they in terms of so-called VIPs, but who are they in terms of ordinary men and women. And I think that we have to get to the point psychologically where we take each other a little bit more seriously and ourselves a little less seriously.
Your Highness, thank you so much for this enlightening conversation. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you very much.
I would like to thank you also my colleagues, אהרון ברנע, עקיבא אנדר, thank you too. ותודה גם לכם שהייתם איתנו בארמון המלוכה באמן. להתראות בשבוע הבא, פגוש את העיתונות, שבת 12:30.